So from the Greeks, we've got this notion of our being a detached self. We can be critical, we can be reflective, we can be rational, we can be objective. But that doesn't determine at all who you are. In fact, it sort of wipes you out. So that because in ethics you do what everybody does, the rational thing, you contemplate these rational patterns, you merge with the rational patterns of the universe, and there isn't any you. There's something, any individual you. There is this thinking you. But then there is the Judeo-Christian tradition, and now we have to talk about that in the same categories that we talked about the Greeks. And the existentialists are on the side of the Judeo-Christian tradition. They're critical of this whole Greek view. They might even be distorting it, but I don't think so. I'm enough of an existentialist to think that what I just told you is an accurate description of the amazing power that to think and be objective that we've invented qua Greeks, that the Greeks invented and we've inherited. But there is this other tradition now. They don't divide things up into the epistemological and morality and metaphysics. They're too busy acting, running around doing things in history to have this kind of philosophical study. But you can sort of ask yourself anyway, what are the Hebrews saying about truth? That's the epistemology one first. Well, it's a very different notion of truth. Truth is not this objective getting true beliefs that correspond to the way the world is. Truth is being true to somebody, and particularly in this religious aspect, being true to God. That we have this expression still. Are you being true to him? Are you being true to her? Are you being true to yourself? And we still have, for those who are in this tradition, particularly here the Hebrews, that there is a sense of being true to God. That is, God asks that the Hebrews have a total commitment to him, and he makes a covenant with them that he will watch over them if they obey and are devoted to him. And that's a kind of truth. It's not a detached contemplation kind of truth. It's I just wondered, is this turned on? David, did we turn it on? Okay. Instead of a detached contemplation kind of truth, it's a total commitment kind of truth. To be true to God is to keep the covenant. And that's the highest form of truth there is. That makes, you can see all sorts of differences. For Greeks, the truth is open to all the people because every human being has a universal, rational, theoretical capacity. And if you teach them, any people, Greek, then they can also, say, do geometry. There's a dialogue, the Meno, where Socrates teaches a slave boy who doesn't have any philosophical education step by step to prove the Pythagorean theorem. That's a very different way of looking at the people who are not automatically in your group. For the Hebrews, since truth is revealed by God as this request, this demand to be true to him, it's revealed at a certain time and a certain place, and then it's written down in the Torah and preserved in the tradition. So truth is not universal and timeless like it is for the Greeks. It's local and historical for this particular people at this particular time who got this particular message. So how do you deal with outsiders? Well, like in the Meno, you can teach them Greek and teach them math and integrate them into this theoretical world of thinking. But when the Hebrews deal with outsiders, they don't try to, or particularly the early ones. I mean, the Hebrew, don't write me email as I get from the podcast people and people in office hours telling me that after all, the Judaism and the Ten Commandments is for everybody and so forth. eventually it got that way. But I'm talking about at the beginning. At the beginning it wasn't for everybody. There were the Hebrews with their covenant, and everybody else was idol worshippers. And with idol worshippers, you just ignore them, or if they get in the way, you kill them. But what you don't do is convert them. That would be that because the covenant wasn't made with them. By the way, stop me if you think that you disagree or that you don't understand. And so the ultimate authority. And wait a minute. I want to make. Yeah. Now we're in morality. I've just finished truth, and now the next one is morality. There, the ultimate authority is God, not reason, and you can see it if you look at the Euthyphro. I did mention the Euthyphro already. Am I repeating myself at all? Why did I mention the Euthyphro already? Maybe I didn't. And did I? Yeah, why did I? I don't know. Anyway, I'm going to mention the Euthyphro again. I don't think I said this, that in the Euthyphro, Socrates is trying to tell Euthyphro what the right thing to do is, or help Euthyphro figure it out. Because Euthyphro, I think I did say this, has to decide whether to turn in his father, who's killed a slave, or left him to die in a ditch, really, or not. But Socrates is trying to find common ground so that he can reason with Euthyphro about what he ought to do. And that turns out to be hard. So he does find it by asking Euthyphro, is an action good because the gods love it, or do the gods love it because it's good? The actual phrase, if you go look it up, is he says, is it good because the gods, because it's pious, or is it pious because the gods approve? That I just put it, I keep it in my way because that's a more normal way to put it. So the question is, if you're going to do something, and in this case, turning your father or not, the question is the right thing to do what the gods approve of, or is there some independent way of finding out what is the right thing to do, and then everybody who's rational, including the gods, will approve of it? What do you think? Is an action pious because the gods love it, and approve of it, or do the gods love it and approve of it because it's pious, because it's good? Now we're asking for not your opinion, but Euthyphro's opinion. If you're a Greek, what do you say? You what? Yeah, she says in Greco-Roman mythology the gods were largely immoral. And that's true, but what we're hearing is Socrates doesn't like mythology, and he doesn't like the gods, and he's trying to, in fact, that's what he gets in trouble for. Socrates finally gets tried by the Athenians for inventing new gods, which the new god, I think, is rationality, and he thinks that mythology is exactly, and tradition is exactly not right. So, and insofar as these gods behave in this immoral way, you just have to not count them. If there's some rational right thing to do, which they hadn't figured out yet with Euthyphro, but there is something right to do. You either have to turn in your father or not. And it's a complicated case because there are duties on both sides and so forth. But whatever the right rational ethical answer is, Euthyphro has to obey it, or else he's doing bad things, and the gods obey it because it's the right thing to do. Now the interesting thing in getting ready for reading Kierkegaard is to ask the Hebrew story. Is an action good because the gods approve it, command it, require it, or is it required because it's good? And moreover, he's absolutely right. What is good is what God declares to be good, and he declares it not in general, which would make it more back to the Greeks, but for each person in each situation. It's whatever God requires of them that is the right thing to do. Now, if you're going to push that to an extreme, what would you say? Let's find a case in which it is really clear that something is good if God requires it, no matter what you might normally and ethically and rationally think about it. It doesn't matter. It's what God demands. What would be the extremist case in the Bible of that? Yes, Abraham sacrificing Isaac on the front of your book. Exactly. There it is. God says, kill your son, and it becomes the right thing for Abraham to do. And he will show his faith and be admired as the father of the faith if he does succeed in killing his son. Now, Kierkegaard's got lots of worries about that. How's that going to look to Sarah and to the rest of everybody else? And we'll have to talk about that. Those are what's called the problems, where Kierkegaard goes through problem 1 and 2 and so forth. But the answer, the problems arise because they all agree that if God commands it, it's the right thing to do, no matter what it seems to normal, rational people just watching what's going on. And what God commands is different for every person. Everybody has their own calling. Everybody has their own situation, and everyone is trying to do what God requires of them in that. And that means God's command to kill Abraham, and that's sort of what you weren't quite clear about. It isn't God's requirement to kill Abraham. To kill Isaac, it isn't something like a statement about what's good in general is up to God. It's that what counts as good in each particular situation is up to God. It doesn't, when God tells Abraham to kill Isaac, he doesn't mean that if you're a good, pious father, you should kill your son. That all good fathers should kill their sons. It just says, Abraham, that the thing your duty is to do is to kill your son. Okay, that's a pretty strange form of ethics, and it causes lots of problems, which Kierkegaard is happy to take on in the book. And finally, okay, now metaphysics, we're not going to get into that nearly so much as the truth issues and the what's right and wrong issues, but it's important to see the contrast. Remember, for the Greeks, the thing you want to do is contemplate the eternal, like in mathematics, or even the laws of science that don't change with time. Change is upsetting, and you can't have a theory if the universe is going to change its rules, or if you keep changing the rules. So time is a bother to be gotten out of. Well, not for the Hebrews. Time is where everything important happens. And for the Greeks, nothing important happens in time. Remember, the universe, I said, just recycles, and people just make it explicit in their lives, the sort of character that they have from the moment they're born. There is no change of any importance. And consider all the important things that happen in time. Well, first, it gets created. It's hard to know what it is to say that time, at a certain moment, time starts. But that's the view. It started 5,784 years ago, to be exact, according to the Hebrew calendar that is still counting. And that's when it all got created. Even if the dates are wrong, they don't believe in constant recycling. They believe that there was a moment in which the universe was created. As I said, I'm pretty sure last time, they would believe the Big Bang story, not the Big Crunch story, which the Greeks would believe. And, okay, first for that. And then there are other crucial moments. There's the covenant with God, which we talked about. Abraham gets this special relation. There's Moses, who at another time, particular date, in a particular place, gets the Ten Commandments. Then the most important thing happens. What it is exactly is a complicated story, which we aren't going to go into very much, but God becomes man and shows up at a particular place in history. That's the jargon for that is that's the incarnation. That's Jesus, who is God and who shows up as a particular person in a particular place, which is a scandal from the point of view of the Greeks, that the ultimate truth, the ultimate goodness, the ultimate everything is a particular being, a human being, who is also God and is in time. So that if God is eternal, Well, for the Greeks, and in a certain way for the Hebrews, then the eternal shows up at a particular moment for the Hebrews. That's what is the scandal for the Greeks. And how does it work in terms of individual people? Well, people can only, remember, develop their character, make explicit what's implicit. There was this thing called the human potential movement once upon a time in the 70s, which was trying to sort of bring out what's best in people. And you can't do anything more than bring out what's best in people, because there's no such thing as radical creation on that view. But the Hebrew view has, not only is the universe created, but people are subject to radical transformation. You know it under the description, being reborn. Being reborn is very different. A Christian concept of being reborn is not at all like bringing out your human potential, making explicit what's best in you. Kierkegaard says there's nothing good in you. That's what original sin is supposed to say and explain. You've got to be transformed into what Kierkegaard calls in our reading a new being. You become, if you were reborn, you become a new being, and that's radical transformation, not growth or realization or development. Okay, one more point, and that is also worlds are radically changed. I mean, it isn't as if you just go from the Greek world from the Homeric world to the Athenian Greek world to the Roman. Those are all, from the Greek point of view, continuous. I mean, they went on reading and reciting Homer, so to speak, through it all. But the way it looks to the Judeo-Christian is that a radically new world was created when God became man. So radically new that we got BC and AD. There's before Christ and after God. That's what those letters are short for. And that means there was a time before the world was changed, and that was the pagan world. And then there was the time that God came into the world, and then that was the Judeo-Christian world. And that is a radical transformation. It wasn't as if the saints were implicit and Jesus was implicit in the Roman world all along and it became explicit. It's just nothing like that was there, and then there it was. Okay, now, then let's have a stop to see if anybody wants to say anything. And then I'll have to start drawing out the consequences of the fact that there are these two radically different traditions. And by the way, help me remember to give out, I've written down what I'm just saying, but I just don't want to interrupt the summing up. I want to hand a handout in which everything on one side is the Hebrew story and on the other side is the Judeo-Christian story, so you'll be able to hold on to it, because that's sort of backbone of the course. But the issue is how to get these two traditions, which seem so opposed to each other, together in some way. And that is, I'm going to just run through them in a hurry, just to remind you, and then we're going to talk about how to do it. Let's sum them up. The Greek view of truth is objectivity. The Greek view in morality is don't make an exception of yourself, and you could sum that up as the universal is higher than the individual. So you should do what everyone would do, every good person would do in that situation. And the story and ultimate reality is to reach eternity, you have to get out of time, and that's a good thing to do. And the opposite view, to sum it up, is truth is being true to something specific and local. It's involved personal commitment. And the ethical is you do what God requires of you as an individual. That's the only good thing you can do. And time is where everything meaningful happens, and particularly new things happen, totally new things. And even God must show up in time, which means something I can't explain to you yet, but it will become important in the course. Eternity is only possible in time. A very, very weird view. But Kierkegaard holds that view, and so does Dostoevsky. So now, what happens? Well, you want to be thoughtful, as a good human being and having the capacity to think and be rational, have theories, and you want to be active. You need to think, and you need committed action. And the question really is, for anybody in this culture, how to get them together, or which one to cancel, or which one trumps which one. And this is a unique kind of question for our culture, I think. And if people want to disagree about this, I'd be happy to hear other examples. I mean, we've got two totally worked out views of what it is to be a human being, what reality is, what people are like, and the self, and what they should be doing. And they don't seem to fit together. They seem to be totally opposed to each other. We are a completely conflicted culture. It's just amazing. Amazing, too, that people don't talk about it more and worry about it more. They do. They just don't notice that that's what they're doing. I'll try to say that in a minute. But I think I want to say, just as contrast, there are other cultures, I think, in which there are two traditions. I think in China, as I understand it, so Buddhism and Confucianism and Taoism, there are, in fact, three traditions all existing side by side, and they don't contradict each other. They complement each other, or they ignore each other. And in Japan, well, it's really amazing. I spent a month in Japan, and one of the things I learned was that there are more people signed up for various organized religions than there are people in Japan. And that's because they sign up for several religions. And the most popular thing I heard, people told me when I was there, is that at birth it's a good thing when somebody's born to have a Hindu ceremony. And there's something really great about getting married, particularly good if you have a Christian wedding. And as you die, it's a good thing to die as a Buddhist. And that doesn't bother them. In fact, it's wonderful. And they have 1,000 other gods besides. And it's a really polytheistic culture. But that's not ours. We've got a kind of two monotheistic views. One, everything built around theory and rationality, and one, everything built around commitment and action. And what do you do about that? Well, first I'm just going to sum up. I'll read it slowly because I sort of like my list of these things. Here's the final summing up of the opposition. The Greek tradition is to be detached, disembodied, timeless, universal, reflective, critical, rational. And the Hebrew story is to be involved, embodied, historical, local, and committed to something specific. And if you're in a culture like that, whether you like it or not, you're very confused. We're all very confused, I think, because we live in these two worlds, the thinking theoretical kind of world and the committed Judeo-Christian world, whether we believe in and sign up for those different views or not. But I think it's a kind of challenge to show, and again, it's maybe some possible paper topic if you've got a good example that I have. I don't claim to have all the right examples, but I wanted to say that. I see I've changed the order of what I'm going to say. No, sorry. I'm going to say how I think finally we're still in these contradictions. But I wanted to do a historical run-up to us instead of jump in where we are. So just save that heading for a minute. The first reaction was to what to do about it. These two deeply different ways of life. You see, they're really different ways of life. I mean, either you contemplate God and you as a completely rational being, as in Plato, or you go about actively doing your individual calling, and those are very different. So what do you do about it? Well, there's a whole enterprise of 1,500 years of trying to get these two together, to conceptualize the Judeo-Christian revelation in Greek philosophical terms, to put Judeo-Christian religious experience into Greek concepts. That would be wonderful. Then you get it all together. And this is something now I'm going to tell you. Don't feel you need to know this for your papers or for your exam. It would be some other course. In fact, it's my other course, Philosophy 6, where this gets spelled out more. But you have to run through it just briefly. So the Gospel of John, I'm always curious, how many, well, there's several different issues, I wonder. How many are some form of believing Christian in this audience? How many are some other religion? Any other? How many are secular? Don't have any particular. Well. It's a secular age. And a very important book has just come out about 6 months ago called A Secular Age by Charles Taylor. This is just another confirmation of it. He won a $1.5 million prize for that book because it is so right on. But okay, I'm worried only for the how many don't know anything about the Christian tradition and find this all about incarnate gods and so forth just weird. Well, you're a lot better off than I was at your age. I thought it was completely weird. I'm Jewish. I didn't see the New Testament until I was something like 22. I thought it was the wildest thing I'd ever read. And I've been thinking about it ever since, and also feeling about it ever since, I guess. But anyway, now I have it. But if you did, I was going to tell you, then you should certainly talk to your TA or get him to or her to recommend something. I don't know what book it would be that would tell you. I mean, but if it doesn't seem absolutely alien or strange to any of you, that's good. But so then you will understand when I say that the Gospel of John, of the four Gospels, John is considered the latest, and people think not written by the Apostle John, but much later, in around 200 AD maybe. Anyway, John speaks of Jesus as the Logos. You who know the Bible know that John begins, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was made flesh. But the word, for what gets translated word, is the Greek term logos. And logos is something like the Greek name for the eternal rational structure of the universe. So there's this logos. It gets made flesh. And that's already pretty amazing. So this eternal rational structure of the world, that doesn't spell right, is it? Or is it? F-L-E-S-H? Is that right? Okay. So there's the eternal structure of the world, which then gets somehow incarnated, embodied in a particular human being walking around Bethlehem and Jerusalem. That's pretty weird. That's already an attempt to state the Christian message that God became incarnate in Jesus in Greek terms, as if God were this eternal structure somehow got to be made flesh in Jesus. Very hard to make any sense of it, but I think I can. But not that's Philosophy 6. Try to explain that John is right, that there is something like that going on. Yeah. The Gospel of John, now it was written in Greek, right? The Gospel of John is written in Greek already, because that's important. And that's why whoever wrote the Gospel of John is trying to state what whatever happened in Jerusalem and around there, which is people are writing about and is very strange, to make it fit Greek philosophy. And then the next move is St. Augustine. So I used to teach St. Augustine. He's really interesting, but somehow there's not room to do everybody. About 300 A.D., Augustine, in his Confessions, which is his most accessible and important book, is very busy trying to put Christianity in Platonic terms. He thinks that Plato's notion of the good, which was eternal and intelligible and the order of everything, is the Greeks getting a sort of glimmer of what the Judeo-Christians now know as God, but it doesn't work out very well for Augustine, because he thinks that why, if you can have a direct contemplation of God, which Plato thought you could, of the good, then what about all these things in the world? They just sort of get in the way. They grab you and attract you. The first for him women, and then later the fragrance of incense and the beauty of stained glass windows, but all kinds of things are constantly distracting you from the contemplation of God. How in the world can we say the world is good? Well, Augustine concludes, well, the world isn't good for us. It's a temptation for us, but it must be good for God. But we don't know about that. And then, of course, Augustine has a terrible time with Jesus. I mean, what in the world is the Greeks can't make anything of this incarnation. And Augustine can't really make anything of Jesus. He plays practically no role. Well, he plays an interesting role, but I'm not going to tell you about it. But it's hard for Augustine to make sense of it. And it's very hard for Augustine to make sense of how this God, which should be rational and good in a general, universal way, is calling Abraham to kill his son. And Augustine sort of squirms around over that one and finally says, well, the moral is it's a generally good thing to obey God. And that's what we're supposed to get out of reading this. Don't think it's a generally good thing, and certainly not a particularly good thing for Abraham to kill Isaac. So Augustine doesn't work out very well trying to map the Christian revelation on Plato, which is what he had to go on. But then, thanks to the Arabs who translated the Greeks and preserved them throughout the Dark Ages or the Middle Ages, and they found these strange lecture notes in some chest in some basement, I gather, and it turns out and in Greek, that was Aristotle, and Aristotle got translated then into Arabic and then into Latin, and then the next hero of this disastrous enterprise is St. Thomas Aquinas. About 1300, who puts it all into Aristotelian. That did a lot better job because Aristotle thought that individual... If I misspell that one? Aristotelian. Oh, it looks okay. That was pretty good because Aristotle thought that what the concrete things were as important as the prime mover. He had something like a God in it, but that wasn't a big deal for him. What the big deal was individual substances, and that was better. And there was something else I was going to say about that. Just a second. Of course, Aristotle can't think that the world was created. He doesn't. Augustine has to fix that. Aristotle has no place, of course, for Jesus in his philosophy, and Augustine tacks that revelation on at the end, having taken over a whole Aristotle picture of the universe. And all of this is worked out in Dante's Divine Comedy, which, as I teach in Philosophy 6, but I can't go into here. But it doesn't work out too well for St. Thomas Aquinas either. Oh yeah, I wrote it down here. And the way you can see it didn't work out is sort of interesting. Aristotle has an ethics book. Nobody knows whether Aristotle wrote these things or whether they're his lecture notes or whether they're students' lecture notes, but there is an Aristotle Nicomachean ethics book, and people are still arguing 2,000 years later about the fact that the whole first half of the book is about how important it is to be a political person with your fellow citizens, making decisions in the world. And then the last book says the most important thing human beings can do is withdraw from the world and contemplate and do philosophy. And people still don't know how Aristotle is trying to get those two things together. And St. Thomas inherits that problem. There isn't any good way to get the two things together, I think. And another way that problem shows up, which is really interesting and fun, if you were reading, there was a movement at the time of St. Thomas and Dante So Dante's putting St. Thomas into poetry. He's writing a book about his girlfriend Beatrice that he says nobody has ever written such a poem before. That's the Divine Comedy. And the Divine Comedy, most people don't even notice it, it's so outrageous, puts Beatrice in place of Jesus as Dante's savior. Dante's able to do it because there's a group called the Troubadours who have started this, taken over Christianity in a funny way and started writing about knights and ladies, and how knights are totally devoted to their lady with unconditional commitment and ready to die for their lady, and that gives their life meaning, and their lady is in a sense their savior, and it's sort of a combination of Christianity and romantic, and they're inventing romantic love. They're turning Christianity into romantic love, and that's all terrific, except that Dante, being in the St. Thomas tradition and having swallowed a lot of Greek philosophy by way of St. Thomas, has to give up Beatrice in the end. And in the very end of the Divine Comedy, after he's been saved by Beatrice, after everything in his life has got its meaning from Beatrice, he finally gets a chance to contemplate God directly, and then he leaves Beatrice behind. They give each other one last smile. And then the last line of the Divine Comedy is, Dante says, "And then my love became one with the love that moves the sun and the other stars." He was, in other words, wiped out as an individual, merged into the universal and eternal, and Christianity got wiped out by Greek thought once again. Yeah. But does that help? I mean, once, you see, Beatrice was, Dante, it happens in two ways, but I don't want to go into it too much. Dante was very involved in politics in Florence and kicked out of Florence for political reasons, but by the time he gets to the top of the paradise, he looks back and thinks of all that politics as just petty nonsense on the thrashing room floor, because he's seen God. And God is so totally fulfilling that nothing else is necessary or fits in anywhere. And so the fact that Beatrice was definitely sent by Mary, and Mary is in there contemplating God, and Beatrice is there contemplating God, and Dante is, what's missing, or Dante wouldn't call it missing, what has happened is Beatrice has done her job. She's become the way to get Dante to the truth, and Jesus says, "I am the truth and the way." And what's happening is, in the whole attempt to deal with this, the Jesus, who's a finite, temporal human being, can't be understood as the truth. He can only be understood as the way, which leads you up, finally, to the contemplation of this eternal truth. Now Kierkegaard's going to get us out of that in a minute, but we got to wait till we get there. So Dante leaves Beatrice behind, contemplates God, and then 300 years after Dante, we get Descartes. His most important book, The Meditations, is 1638. I happen to know that one date. And Descartes thinks he's a good Christian, it seems, and gives a kind of philosopher's view of God, who is eternal, infinite, perfect, completely intelligible, and Descartes even offers a proof of the existence of that God. Of course, there's no place in Descartes for loving God, for commitment and covenants with God, certainly not for embodied God as in Jesus, and so forth. By the time you get to Descartes, you've gone from the Gospel of John to Descartes, and you've wiped out everything that was true of Christianity by trying to think it. But every time you try to put it in Greek terms, you can't grasp what's really amazingly original and interesting about it. And now comes, the hero, Pascal. Pascal is the first existentialist because he says, maybe I have to borrow back, I don't seem to have any of my Pascal quotes. Somebody give me the Pascal quotes. The top quote is the crucial one for us. Pascal has this big religious experience, and in it, and out of it he says, the top quote, God of Abraham, God of Isaac, God of Jacob, not of the philosophers. That's one way of putting That's to say, Descartes says, stop this nonsense of trying to put these two together. The philosophers are doing, and Plato and the Greeks are doing one thing, and the Judeo-Christians are doing another thing. They've got a different understanding of God. And, the next quote, they've got a different understanding of the role of reason. It's not reason that really matters, finally. It's emotion. It's the heart that experiences God, the Christian God anyway, not the reason. This is faith, God felt by the heart, not by reason. And then there's a whole thing here which I can't go into, but I give you these interesting quotes where Pascal is quite clear that this Christian God, this Judeo-Christian God, is not at all like the God of the philosophers, eternal, intelligible, universal, and so forth. So he says, I'll start reading the next one, the God of the Christians is not a God who's the author of mathematical truths. He's really aiming at Descartes. Descartes was one generation before Pascal. Pascal is, I don't know, did I have a date for Pascal? Probably not. But consider him a generation after 1650. Okay. So here's Pascal. And so now he's saying, and I put that in, he's a little more, okay, I guess I'll live with it. So he's saying, it isn't so clear after that. He says he's not the God of the Hebrews either, the Christian God, and he's making distinctions which for us we don't care about. Because he doesn't, in a certain way, care about it either, because the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob is the God that he also believes in. But now the interesting thing is, I can't say much about it in this course, but the God that you could prove the existence of, like Descartes, is Pascal, who's a brilliant mathematician and does natural science and writes this fantastic book of Pensées. He thinks that he says one of the Pensées. Did I put it down here? No, I didn't. But he says we can prove the existence of God and we can prove the non-existence of God. I think I mentioned that once. This is to say, this isn't the kind of God that you can prove and contemplate and draw conclusions from, just a second, the rationality of them and so forth. This is a God, and that's what is interesting, that is a hidden God. There, you can't get a full understanding or experience like Dante thought he could of the radiance in the face of God. We're in darkness, he says in the quote in the middle of the page, in the middle of the quote. He has left men in darkness from which they can escape only through Jesus Christ, without whom all communion with God is cut off. In fact, Kierkegaard puts that one step further and says, with Jesus Christ, all communication with God is cut off, and instead of without whom. Because Kierkegaard thinks that if you get in the right relation to the God-man, Jesus, you won't even be trying to get into a relation anymore with this super being, the supreme being, and so forth. We haven't got to that yet. But Pascal's already got the idea that there is something about the Christian God which is hidden and which we don't even need to get there by way of having some path, that there's a way of having Christian truth in this world somehow incarnated in Jesus. We haven't done that yet. Okay, Hegel does something he is very interesting and brilliant. He tries to show, in effect, that Christianity, Judeo-Christianity, is a kind of mythical, somewhat confused understanding of us and the universe, but that through the course of history, we gradually get an understanding of human beings and institutions, which is the real inner truth of Christianity, becoming explicit in history. So there he's got something that the Greeks could recognize as okay, and he thinks that he's shown that everything that's sort of rational and valid in Christianity has been preserved in Christianity, and the superstitious part we can just get rid of. That's the last straw for Kierkegaard, who is a Christian, and he doesn't want Christianity to be taken to be a kind of fable, a kind of myth, a kind of which has a grain of more than a grain of truth in it, but we don't need it. Once we get philosophy worked out and history worked out, we get everything that's important about Christianity. Kierkegaard says absolutely not. Now, I think now I'm tempted to jump to I'm going to talk about Kierkegaard right now. Kierkegaard comes along. I may talk next time about how we live in these contradictions and how they show up in our lives. But I'm going to start talking about Kierkegaard right now. And so you understand what you read right now. So Kierkegaard is the first existential thinker. Because Kierkegaard has this amazing idea. Well, I better let you collect this. I think maybe I can't do two things at once. I'm going to try, though. Kierkegaard thinks that if you push it to an extreme, you will see that exactly how the Judeo-Christian experience is unthinkable in Greek terms. And how you do that? Well, try to state the Judeo-Christian in Greek terms, and you come out with claims which look completely crazy. Kierkegaard holds that, I'm quoting him now, truth is subjectivity. How can that be when for the Greeks truth is objectivity? Well, you have to have a whole new story about truth, which will look a lot more like the Judeo-Christian one. It will look a lot more like a commitment. And then, in fact, that's what he's doing. But he's making it sound, instead of thinking it and trying to make it coherent, the Greek and the Christian, he's trying to make them as absolutely opposed as possible. And then he's going to show that the philosophical story isn't totally wrong. It has a place, but it's subordinate to the Judeo-Christian. But I'm jumping ahead. Right now, the slogans I want to give are three. Truth is subjectivity. The individual is higher than the universal. That's the ethical one. And eternity is only possible in time. Those are all ways of showing that trying to think the Judeo-Christian story leads to paradoxes, to statements which are absolutely incomprehensible nonsense from a Greek point of view. And now, but by taking those statements and giving them a new meaning, he manages to, in a certain way, give us a kind of intellectual grip on what is special about the Judeo-Christian tradition instead of trying to smush it into the Greeks. Now I'm going to just jump to Fear and Trembling for 15 minutes because I'm so touched and shocked and pleased that you've all done the reading that I cannot now leave you without some guidelines. So I'm going to I got 15 minutes, I'll get to the most important thing about the reading today, I promise. But let me say a few introductory things. This is the hardest book in the course, I told you that. And that's partly because it's such a strange form of writing. And on the title page, you discover that Kierkegaard wants to call it, on the very, very first page, Fear and Trembling, a Dialectical Lyric by Johannes de Silentio. I wanted to comment on all of that sort of subtitle. A dialectical lyric is a completely paradoxical and contradictory thing. Dialectics was invented by Socrates. It's arguing by thinking of general principles and then counterexamples and then making your principles take account of the counterexamples. And lyrics, of course, are poetic expressions of emotions. And this is a philosophical, poetical book, which seems contradictory. And yet he's going to do it, and he does it. He's going to argue in these anti-philosophical but nonetheless traditional terms about this profoundest experience that he's had. Now, what that profound experience is, I'll get to in a minute. But the next thing to notice on the title page is this book isn't by Kierkegaard exactly, it's by Johannes de Silentio. Kierkegaard almost always wrote in pseudonyms because he's always telling you how the world looks from a particular perspective. And this perspective, we don't know yet what it means, is the perspective of what he calls a night of resignation. Notice that it's a night, K-N-I-G-H-T, and there's a night of faith. it's no coincidence he's connecting up with the troubadours, with the knights and the ladies, and with romantic love. That's the lyric part. Sort of the phenomenon of romantic love is going to be very important. And then there's more weirdness. Johannes de Silentio is the John who is keeping silent. And then he emphasizes that with the epigraph. Where is it that we're... the Fear and Trembling begins with this thing, what Tarquin the Proud said in his garden with the poppy blooms was understood by the son but not the messenger. What in the world is that? Well, that says this book is really code. It's about something else. And what it seems to be about isn't what it's really about. And that's right. It seems to be about a kind of romantic love. I'll give you more quotes in a minute. But it's really about a specific situation, namely that Kierkegaard, I think I jumped something else to get to this, that Kierkegaard, having looked at this young lady, I think she was only about 16, I'm not sure, maybe even younger, from the terrace of a cafe, fell in love with her, rushed up to her and proposed to her. I don't know how exactly true all this is. It doesn't matter. There's a huge amount of gossip still going on about Kierkegaard and his relation to Regina. And he didn't help any by writing books, a whole book of what happened every day between him and Regina, called Stages on Life's Way, a boring book. This is all sick. But the amazing thing is, like a great philosopher, out of this sick love that Kierkegaard's got for Regina, he manages to discover a sort of truths about romantic love and about the Judeo-Christian tradition that a lot saner people have never seen. So what he did was he proposed to her, they got engaged, and then he broke his engagement. And that made a lot of gossip, because apparently in Denmark in 1850, you don't just go around making and breaking engagements. So Kierkegaard was in total shock, and Regina was in total shock, and Kierkegaard ran off to Berlin and wrote Fear and Trembling. And the secret message of Fear and Trembling is, if he and Regina behave in the right way, they'll get back together again. And only it's going to turn out to be very, very peculiar and hard thing to do. And then she, instead of believing this book, which was certainly written for her and which she certainly read, she married a nice bourgeois, sane person named Schlegel. And then Kierkegaard went into new shock and ran off to Berlin again and wrote 2 more books, with the Repetition and what? I can't remember the third one. What? Anybody know? Either or. No. Did you write that in Berlin at the same time? No, that was already written, I think. What? He did. Okay. So he wrote, and then, so now what's going on? He wants to be a knight of faith, and he's going to tell us later what that is. And he's going to do it in terms of, and now comes the crucial thing, what he calls the lad's relation to the princess. Now, let me just sort of introduce that little quote, because it's just a quote in passing, but it turns out to be important. I haven't given the page yet. I'm going to tell you in a minute. So if this talk of Abraham and Isaac and knights of faith and knights of resignation is a kind of secret cover-up of a secret message to Regina, where in the book do you find out what the book is really about? And that means, where in the book is the phenomena? Remember I said that every existentialist has a kind of revealing experience out of which they see the world and out of which they're writing. Well, what is this revealing experience? Well, I had to tell you as I taught, it's a certain conception of romantic love, and the actual phenomena is, he tells you, and you should always, when you read existentialist books, ask yourself, sort of, what is the phenomena out of which this person is seeing everything? Since I didn't expect to get here, I have to go find the phenomena, but it's not hard. It doesn't happen right at the beginning, and it happens in a kind of casual way. Here we are, on 72, or maybe a little before that. The bottom of 70. And he sort of says, in effect, this is what it's all about. He's talking about a knight of faith, and he says, this at the bottom of 70, yet this marvel can easily deceive. I will therefore describe the movements in a particular case. That's a funny way of talking he gets from Hegel. The movements means the ways of behaving. So he's going to describe the ways of behaving in a particular case which can illustrate the respective relationships to reality. For it is these that everything turns on. See, so everything in this book is now going to turn on this phenomenon and the ways of dealing with it, the movements that you can make, the actions that you can do. So what's the phenomenon? Well, a simple little sentence. A young lad falls in love with a princess, and the content of his whole life lies in this love. I just want to slightly correct the translation. It makes more sense to say, and can't tell from the Danish. I know a little Danish, but not enough. But I think it ought to be saying, a young lad falls in love with a princess, and the whole content of his life, not the content of his whole life. I don't know what the content of his whole life would mean, but the whole content of his life depends on this love, means that everything about what he thinks about himself and what he thinks about the world, about all that in his life, gets its meaning in terms of his relationship, the lad, to the princess, or Kierkegaard to Regina, or whatever. Or it would be like Dante and Beatrice, the beginning of the troubadour thing. There is some lady in this version of the story that gives meaning and fulfillment and direction and sense of what's relevant and so forth, everything that matters to somebody else's life. And that relationship poses all sorts of problems. Let me just go on. So the whole content of his life lies in the love, and yet the relationship is one that cannot possibly be brought to fruition. You can imagine Regina reading this and finally saying, "Oh, now I see why it's a secret and why he sort of wrapped it around a rock and threw it through my window," or whatever he did. So that's because that's the center of it, and then what does he do on the top of 71? He first makes sure that this reality is the content of his life, about 8 lines down. And his soul is too healthy and proud to be squandered on getting drunk. Well, that's Alistair Hannay at his weirdest, the translator. I'm sure that's not what he means. You can equally well read it as saying, on an intoxication, or probably best, on an infatuation. What he's really trying to do is make sure that this relationship, which is now the most important thing, which tells him who he is, namely the lover of Regina, just as Dante is the lover of Beatrice, that's not an infatuation. It's going to be something that he can never get rid of. The next sentence is important. He's not afraid to let the love steal into his innermost secret, most hidden thoughts, to let it twine itself in countless coils around every ligament of his consciousness. That's right. And now, the next important thing you need to know is, we've got 5 more minutes, and I don't know how this is related to your reading, but I'm going to put this gestalt on it, this way of thinking about it. The issue is, once you get into one of these, let's call it unconditional commitments, or defining relations, because it tells him who he is. Once you get into it, how do you deal with it? Well, there are 2 more things I need to say before we stop. One of them is that you've got to see that, of course, it's a disastrous thing to get in one of these relations. You become completely vulnerable. What if the other person dies or leaves you? And they've been the whole content of your life. That is, they define who you are. On the middle of 72, you can see him saying this. So the knight makes the movement. He's trying to decide whether this is just an infatuation or not, because in that too there's a kind of concentration. No, the knight does not contradict himself, and it's a contradiction to forget the whole of one's life's content and still be the same. I'm reading that because that's what it means to have a defining relation. You understand who you are by this. You are the one who has this calling or this commitment. Now, and of course, And I want to do one more move before I get back to the disastrousness. I mean, and if it were just about romantic love, it would be interesting, all right. But it wouldn't really be as important as Kierkegaard wants it to be. He wants it to be about any kind of unconditional commitment that you can have, that can give meaning to your life and tell you who you are and what's worth, what you have to do, what your calling is. Let's just take two more. There's a famous one by Luther, and Kierkegaard is a Lutheran, where Luther turns against the Catholic Church, which was an amazing thing to do, and asks sort of why he does it. He says, "Here I stand, I can do no other." Famous quote. That is, something is calling him and telling him that this is what he must do to be, and that's who he is, and he has to do it. And then let's generalize it to Martin Luther King, which is timely. What, 10 days ago or whatever it was, his birthday, when he gives up everything and finally his life happily. The last famous speech where he says he's been on the mountain and it doesn't matter when he dies, and he would like to live to be an old man, but it doesn't matter anymore. He's done what he had to do. He had his unconditional commitment. It wasn't to a person. It was to a cause. It was to justice for the African Americans, not called that yet. But now the question is, once you get defined this way by a person or a cause or whatever it is that gives you your life a definition and tells you who you are, you're in this terrible risk. The risk, namely, that they can leave or die. Or in Martin Luther King's case, he could have just simply had his peace marches, and the white bourgeois from the north wouldn't show up, and he'd fail. In Martin Luther's case, they could have just killed him. But it's risky to have this kind of relation. And now the question is, how do you deal with the risk? And that's the last thing. The Night of Resignation deals with the risk in one way, and manages to do an amazing